Make sure you guys hit the subscribe button if you guys are enjoying the content that we're throwing up. And make sure you guys hit the like button if you enjoy the video. And yeah, let's begin. Okay, so we are getting back into the X-Men. We are with Jonathan Hickman's X-Men Part 4. Now, here's an important thing. All right, I want to point this out right off the bat. One of the questions that a lot of you guys ask is, when do comic books take place, right? Like, when does Marvel Comics, when do these events happen? And Marvel, for the most part, does not really provide definitive dates. They really haven't for a long time. Really since 1980-something, I think was the last time they provided a definitive date. Chris Claremont was the last one to do it. Occasionally they will, right? They don't do it consistently. They used to do it back during like the 60s and 70s. Every once in a while you will. For example, in the Ultimate Universe, when Obama won the presidency in 2008, there was an issue of Miles Morales that had Obama on the front cover, right? So it's like, okay, this is when this takes place. And occasionally they will, you know, depending on what goes on. Jonathan Hickman indirectly does this in the X-Men. And the reason why is because what this does is it initially picks up in Davos, Switzerland with the World Economic Forum, which is a real world event. But the title of this particular forum is basically Globalization for a New Age, How to Secure and Maintain a Cohesive and Sustainable World. Now, for the World Economic Forum that's happening in 2020, which is to say it's happening at the end of January, the name for that one is Stakeholders for a Cohesive and Sustainable World, right? So we know that Hickman is largely borrowing the name from the current World Economic Forum, so we know that this comic seems to take place right about now. It's a little fun Easter egg, but the entire basis behind why this World Economic Forum is happening is because of Krakoa. One thing to bear in mind here is that with Krakoa providing all these different medicines and things like that, they can prolong people's lives, they can cure mental illness, things like that. These are forms of medicine that simply didn't exist in the world. They did in some places. For example, like Wakanda had that kind of stuff. But as most of you guys know, in the comics, Wakanda doesn't really share its resources with the rest of the world. And so because of that, it's one of these things where Krakoa has now popped up and is in a lot of ways a concern for world economic leaders. Because what you have here is a scenario where in a lot of ways, the entire economic aspect of the pharmaceutical industry could be completely upheaved and completely destroyed by what Krakoa has to offer. Because if Krakoa is saying, we'll provide these medicines, and then in turn you have pharmaceutical companies who can't really keep up and can't provide the same kinds of medicines, people will go to Krakoa, right? They'll try to get their medicine through Krakoa. Krakoa has your cure, right? So you'll go through them and you won't go through existing pharmaceutical companies. This and the fact that Krakoa is positioning itself to be its own individual nation with its own governing body is also a concern for a lot of people, because what you have is this scenario where mutants still aren't truly being trusted, right? They're still not really trusted by humanity as a whole. And humanity's fear is that what Krakoa is doing is basically consolidating the mutant population, i.e. marshaling their forces, getting ready to go to war. And initially that wasn't the case, but after the attempted assassination of Charles Xavier, now it's become a topic for a legitimate discussion here. And so what you end up getting here is essentially Cyclops, Magneto, Charles Xavier, Apocalypse, and Gorgon. Gorgon is a character that I don't really think we've talked about before, and his name is Tomi Shishido. Technically he's a mutant, but he's also, well, really he's part of the Hand and had been for a little while. His powers are kind of split in two different factions, right? So you've got his original mutant powers, and then you've got his powers that were given to him when he was resurrected by the Hand. Super strength, super speed, durability, things like that. A lot of that really all of that came from the Hand. His mutant powers were things like empathy, telepathy, the ability to basically turn people to stone by looking at them like Medusa. That was really his initial or his original mutant ability, and that's why you see him here. The other reason why he's here is because if you notice, you do have Apocalypse, who's a pretty heavy hitter. The true diplomats here are Magneto and Xavier. So you've got Cyclops, you got Apocalypse, and you got Gorgon, who are the heavy hitters, who could basically do whatever needed to be done if things went down. And really, Apocalypse is a one-man army. All you really need is him. But getting in here, it's not designed to be like a strike team, right? They're not here to launch an assault. They're here to be diplomatic. Magneto delivers this speech at the end, which is like one of the most amazing things ever, dude. It's so awesome. But like, can we just take a second to look at like Magneto with like his white suit, right? Like he's got this white suit with like a purple shirt and a red tie and like his white hair. He just looks boss. It's also kind of weird to see Apocalypse in a suit. The real question you have to ask here is he wearing an actual suit, or did he modify his body to make it look like he was wearing a suit? That's the question you have to ask. I'm kind of curious. But notice this, for the most part, this is a pretty cordial affair. They're basically being invited to dinner to kind of have this sort of round table discussion about how Krakoa fits into everything. But make no mistake, while humans here are being cordial, fear is the overriding theme of this entire dinner. And the reason why is because what you end up doing is you end up jumping to this revelation that there are strike teams in the building. There are teams that have been tasked for the purpose of, one, being able to block telepathic attack, right, by having these kind of modifications applied to their minds, and two, they're there to take out the mutant threat, or at least that seems to be the case. And right off the bat, Xavier picks up on this, right? And that's a smart thing to do. That's the thing you would have to expect Xavier to do, right? Xavier would not just walk into a building and be totally oblivious as to what's going on in that building, especially after this attempted assassination. And so with that being the case, or really, I guess, successful assassination and his resurrection, with that being the case, of course, he can't read their minds, so he doesn't know what their intentions are. But let's be honest, you've got guys with guns who are basically inside that base, and none of the X-Men are supposed to know that they're there. Obviously, they're there with some measure of ill intent. And so in turn, Cyclops is warned, and he's basically told, hey man, be aware, these guys are here, will you go take care of them? And it's kind of a funny thing, because of course, then, you know, Cyclops tells one of the guards about that whole mutants acting on good behavior and all that kind of stuff. There's been a bit of a change here. And so from there, what you end up doing is you jump into this discussion between the various representatives of Krakoa and the humans who are there. Now, this is hugely important, and this is one of those aspects of Jonathan Hickman writing that I've told you guys about, where you have to pay attention, right? Where this will become important much later on down the line. Because if you look at what's happening in X-Force, right? If you look at the X-Force comic whereby humans basically launch this first strike at us, it's time for us to return in kind. And then you look at this amounts to battle formations, is really how this is. This is the beginning of the human mutant war. And so this initially kicks off with the question, what's the end game here? What's the goal of Krakoa? That's kind of the question that's being asked. And the reality of this is a somewhat of an unfair question. Over the years, like when you look at any particular nation, the United States, or you look at Britain, or you look at France, or Italy, or Spain, or any of those, they really kind of came to their current form by virtue of just multiple conflicts. But it wasn't as though there was an end goal, right? It wasn't as though like when Rome was founded in the very beginning, it's at this point in time, we are going to achieve this place, you know, in like 2020. This is the end goal of where we want to be. The idea of the nation island of Krakoa being founded was to just provide a safe haven for the mutant population. And so when the question's asked, if the end game here is for you guys to just make your own country, then one, we can't ignore the amount of economic destabilization your country's creating, and two, we can't ignore the fear of Krakoa basically being an island for mutants, and then us not really knowing what's going on. And so at the end of the day, the Wakanda representative really makes a good point in simply saying every nation will act in its own self-interest. It's what it does. Every nation exists in such a way to ensure its own sovereignty. Some nations will act with a more imperialist stance, which is to say trying to spread their sphere of influence outside their own country, but at the end of the day, it's to ensure their own sovereignty. If you eliminate all the threats that are out there, then there's nobody there to challenge you, nobody there to pose a danger to you. And so as a result of that, of course, you know, when the question's asked by Magneto, well, does Wakanda want to have some kind of a formal relationship with Krakoa? Then Wakanda's like, no, we're good. You're gonna have to keep doing your own thing. And Wakanda can do that. Wakanda is the most technologically advanced nation in the world. They're way beyond everybody else in terms of medicine, right? So Wakanda doesn't really need anything Krakoa has to offer. But remember, Wakanda's opened itself up to the world. It's now on a grand stage. So Wakanda is really kind of out there doing its own thing, and it doesn't really need anything else the world has to offer. Well, then the question becomes, if Krakoa is going to be a place where mutants can celebrate their heritage and their culture, then why are you hiding from the world? To which Apocalypse immediately responds, does this look like we're hiding? If we were hiding, we wouldn't be here. We wouldn't come to this economic summit. You know, we wouldn't be here to talk to you guys. We would have just declined your offer and continued doing whatever it was that we were doing. Now, kind of the background here, this is kind of a subplot that goes on, is basically Cyclops really by himself going through and taking out all these various forces. Of course, Gorgon's there as well, but Cyclops is doing the brunt of the work, right? Taking out these various henchmen, different things like that. And it's kind of a cool little scenario, because from there, the various representatives here did exactly what the X-Men knew they were going to do, which was try to reverse engineer the various medicines that Krakoa is supplying. And one of the questions they had is it really necessary to take these medicines on a daily regimen? Like, is it necessary to do that? And the response of Magneto is yes, because the way that we've engineered this is it has a cascading effect, right? So you take the pill one day and it starts to impact your body, but eventually it'll fade. But as you continually take this medicine, it'll build on top of itself, eventually achieving that goal. But the reason for why these pills are necessary for long-term use will be explained at the end of the story, because it's absolutely genius. And so at that point, it's just kind of like, okay, so like at the end of the day, how should we interpret Krakoa? Like, are you guys a threat or are you guys not a threat? And the way that Magneto answers this is actually pretty smart. He basically says, well, you interpret us as a threat because you're afraid of anything that you're not familiar with, anything that you don't fully understand. But like any other nation out there, you're just going to have to assume that our goal is to not destroy you. Eventually, like treaties will be signed and things along those lines. But for the most part, every nation that exists out there is operating in some measure on a good faith effort. You know, in the world of nuclear proliferation, it's okay, well, let's just hope you decide not to push the button one day. That's really what it all comes down to. You know, the hope that some dictator doesn't lose their mind, press the button, and then suddenly nuclear bombs get launched somewhere. And so as a result of that, Magneto basically says, like, you believe this because of your history as humanity. At this moment right now, you're teaching your children in schools to unlearn history and to rewrite it in the way that you want it to be. History is written by the victor. And he asks things, he says, like, do you guys know why, you know, how it is that medieval societies got led? It's because they mined it it from Roman ruins. But all this knowledge was lost during the Dark Ages. All this stuff is gone. You guys don't know your own history. And if the history doesn't really seem to agree with the narrative that you want to put out there, then you rewrite history. That's the nature of humanity. That's what you guys consistently do. You change the facts to suit your narrative. And so at the end of the day, it's just kind of like, okay, well, when they start talking about things like the collapse of the Bronze Age, humanity's question is like, well, why should we concern ourselves with the collapse of the Bronze Age? And Apocalypse says, I was alive then, and you should be concerned. And they say, well, then tell us, if you were alive then, what caused the Great Collapse? And Apocalypse says, I was the one who caused it. So it's like, you're talking about some pretty heavy hitters here, like some pretty awesome moments, right? Apocalypse seemingly bringing down society in the Bronze Age. Which is kind of crazy, but it's kind of interesting, because at this point where they're kind of beating around the bush, now it's the full-on core question that's really been kind of lingering on everybody's mind this entire time. Should we be concerned about war? And Magneto's response, this is, man, let me tell you something. This is why Jonathan Hickman writes villains so well, dude, because he does it so well. This part by Magneto is amazing. He says, no, there will not be any war. And when humanity says, is that so? Magneto says, yes, it is. Like, it is true. There will not be any war. Like, can you not see that we as mutants have essentially changed? Take me, for example. In the past, I would have taken all your weapons of war, all your guns, your tanks, your bombs, and I would have turned them on you. And he would have, right? We've seen him do that multiple times. During the Fatal Attraction story, Magneto issued a blanket EMP across the world that took down power to the planet. So this is not something that would be totally impossible or uncommon for him to do. You also get this cool little moment here where Cyclops is facing off against these guys, and one of them has a gun and is going to shoot him. Xavier's basically linking everybody together, and he says, hey, can I get a little bit of help? And like sitting at the dinner table 5 floors above, Magneto uses his powers and rips the gun out of the guy's hand. And it's just like, damn, man. But then like you basically get this amazing thing. He says, basically, we as mutants, we're gonna do what you as humanity do, except we're gonna do it better. We're gonna give people a better life than what you can give them. We're gonna give humanity a better life than what you and your government can do. We're gonna give them longer and healthier existences. And then we're going to take the money, the outrageous amount of money that you're going to pay us, because at the end of the day, it means more money for you, right? The governments buy drugs from Krakoa, and then the governments sell those drugs to the people for a profit of sorts. Like, we're going to take this outrageous amount of money that you're going to give us, and then we're going to buy your banks, and then we're going to buy your schools, and then we're going to buy your media, and then we're going to buy your politicians. And then when we have bought all the rest, we're going to buy you, because you as humanity have taught us as mutants, by virtue of turning us into slaves, things like that, by persecuting us, that everybody has their price. And so once we have this influence, once we have essentially economic control of the world, then we're going to make sure that the wrong kind of people, and you know who they are, will not be able to have any sort of economic power whatsoever. We will not allow them into our institutions. We will not allow them to peddle their outdated and dangerous ideologies. And that's how your entire control of the world is going to end. Like fire without oxygen, it's just going to peter out. It's just going to sort of disappear. And he says, yes, of course there are going to be people who are going to disagree with us. Yes, there are going to be people who are going to hate us. That's fine. They just won't be able to do anything about it anymore. And it's like, damn, like we're basically going to take your entire world out from under you. That's literally what he says. That's the goal of Krakoa, to buy everything in the world, to basically take away any control you have on your planet. And essentially, we will control everything. We will decide what kind of education you guys get. It's absolutely genius, right? Because it's a war that's won without any real fighting. It's a war that's won by virtue of just saying, like, we're in turn going to take over the world by requiring you to be a part of what we do. That's why Krakoa is releasing these medicines that require multiple regimens, right? Taking it multiple times, because what it does is it turns people into slaves or servants to this medication. It's the nature of people. Once we cross that path, we never want to go back, right? We never want to go back to the way things were if we enjoy what we have now more than what we had before. And so because of that, what it does is it switches over to Gorgon. And this is one of the coolest things. Gorgon is basically talking to these guys. After having chopped off all of their arms, he basically talks to them and tells them, in years past, I would have killed all of you. But I think it's more important that you spend your lives living with your failure, that you guys understand things are different now. If you guys believe that the mutant population is going to roll over, that's not the way it is anymore. And so with all of this having been said by Magneto, being said by Gorgon and so on, that in turn Magneto chimes in and says, you're keeping your finger on your ear an awful lot, so let me go ahead and solve this problem for you. They're not coming. The forces that you have around here, they're not coming. And that's when he basically spills the beans, because nobody else knew about it. That's when he basically spills the beans and says, we know about the strike teams that you had in the building. They've been neutralized. And there's no real way for them to kind of combat that and say, well, yeah, we have the strike teams there to kill you, but I mean, why did you take them out? Like, that's not fair. It doesn't really work that way. And And so at the end of the day, humanity, especially the United States, is kind of stuck with egg on their face, because it's sort of like, you're the one that sort of initiated this. We've taken those guys out. They're no longer part of the equation anymore. And so from there, you basically end up having Xavier, who removes his mask, of course, letting us see his face really for one of the first times as part of a House of X, Powers of X, and Dawn of X. And in turn, he says, is it really necessary for you to fear us in such a way? You're going to have to trust us. Like, you're going to have to trust our nation. You're going to have to believe that we want to be sovereign, that we want to be able to do our own thing, that we don't really want to make slaves out of you. But at the end of the day, if that's what it comes down to, then that's exactly what we will do. But understand this, and this is one of the most important things. When they get up and they begin to leave, Xavier says, understand this and have no illusions. Magneto says, we've had fantastic teachers in all of you. You as humans have taught us valuable lessons in what it means to be persecuted, and what it means to be cast off, and what it means to do whatever it takes in order to survive. And so as a result of this, you guys struck first. You guys launched an attack on Krakoa, and you guys assassinated or tried to assassinate Charles Xavier, kind of maintaining that sort of lie that the mission was not a success. But you guys struck first. Understand, if it happens again, expect a response. We will bring the fight to your doorstep. And that's a scary proposition, because in Apocalypse alone, he's enough to essentially wipe the United States out of existence, right? If the guy wanted to, he'd grow to 3,000 feet tall and just walk across the entirety of the United States, just spraying energy beams everywhere and incinerating entire cities. That's the kind of power you have, and that's just Apocalypse. That's not taking into account Magneto, who can totally disrupt the electromagnetic poles. That's not taking into account Xavier, who can scramble the minds of everybody on Earth. That's not even taking into account the reality warpers, right? So you've got Legion, who's floating out there somewhere. You've got Quentin Quire, who's an Omega level telepath. That you got Emma Frost. You've got all these huge heavy hitters that just with about 10 of them could successfully conquer the world like that. And then when you take the rest of the entirety of the mutant population on Krakoa and you add them to that, humanity stands no chance. And that's why this, if anything, is the most terrifying aspect to humanity. This is how the war starts, because it doesn't really start by virtue of a shot, right? It doesn't really start by virtue of like a pot shot. That is kind of the initial confrontation. It starts with fear. It starts with a legitimate concern that if the mutant population wanted to, they could bring the entire world down on its knees and just leave it to burn. But with that being said, guys, we're gonna bring this video to an end. Jonathan Hickman is amazing. If you guys enjoyed this video, make sure you drop a like. If you are new here to Comics Explained, make sure you hit the sub button to become part of the Rob Corps. I said those backwards. I will catch you guys in the next video. Peace.